Hello. Welcome to Vendor Management Tools, How to Evaluate SOC Audit Results. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances. This information is not eligible for continuing professional education, but is provided as a tool to improve vendor management and compliance efforts. Presenting today is Erin Krivanek. Erin has over 10 years of public and private accounting experience, specializing in internal audit, SOX compliance, and controls-based consulting for financial and information technology processes. Erin leads compliance efforts in the Puget Sound region and specializes in control mitigation strategies for clients across the U.S., where she helps them implement controls to assess their SOC reports for proper scope, user entity controls, and testing and procedures and results. Joining Erin is Maria Braun. Maria has over 6 years of public accounting experience conducting SOC 1, 2, and 3 audits, providing attestation services, and assessing IT general controls for SOX 404 compliance programs and internal control assessments. Among her achievements, Maria was named Working Mother Magazine's Working Mother of the Year 2016. This team is responsible for seeing a need to improve insight into and documentation of a SOC audit report and making this a reality. Erin and Maria, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Good afternoon. So this is Erin, and I'm going to kick us off today. Maria and I are going to be presenting a internal audit tool that we've built specifically to be used for evaluating SOC reports. This is something where Maria and I have spent a lot of time working with SOC reports. We have done SOC audits and developed those reports, and we've also worked with organizations that have to evaluate those reports, whether it's from an internal control assessment, whether it's part of the financial statement audit assessment, or other SOC assessments. So we're very familiar with them. We understand what kind of goes into them, how they are developed, and then also really how to evaluate them to make sure that they're meeting the needs of your organization. So hoping that we can share some insights with you guys today on how to evaluate these things, share some of the specifics about how we evaluate them, and really make it easier for you guys to evaluate them on your own. So before we jump in, just want to give a quick refresh on the definitions of the SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3 report. The key thing to know here is that an SOC 1 is a report on controls at a service organization that will cover internal controls over financial reporting, whereas a SOC 2 report will cover a wider breadth of information, including controls at a service organization that also may relate to compliance or operations, and are generally based on the trust services principles and criteria. The SOC report is generally the report that provides the auditor's opinion on whether the SOC 2 report was effective or not, but it generally doesn't have all of the detail that an SOC 2 would require. So before we jump into the tool, I think it's important to talk about who might actually use this tool, who would actually be evaluating an SOC report. So the primary users that we think that would benefit most from this tool would be entities that are undergoing an SOC audit that includes reliance on another service organization as part of their SOC audit, and this may be an SOC 1 or an SOC 2 report, and then also entities that are relying on an SOC report from a service provider to satisfy compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley. We see a lot of that, and that's generally an SOC 1 report. So now I'm going to turn it over to Maria so that she can start walking us through the tool.
Thank you, Erin. So walking through the SOC tool, Moss Adams have developed a tool to help provide guidance on the evaluation of the SOC report and the key information which should be evaluated. The tool has 3 areas: summary sheet, control reliance evaluation, and the client control considerations mapping and review. The summary sheet presented here was designed with the purpose to inventory the third-party vendors and evaluate the related system and organization's control reports. Information such as type, audit period, if any subservice providers are listed, bridge letter listing any material changes outside of the examination period are considered in the company's evaluation. This is the Control Reliance tab, where each of the control objectives for SOC 1 or criteria for SOC 2 will be evaluated for relevancy to the company and assessed for their effectiveness. This is the Control Consideration Review tab to review the complementary user entity controls specified in the service organization's report and to map to the existing controls within the organization. For our example of a SOC report evaluation, since the majority learned best hands-on, we have taken a redacted copy of a service organization SOC report. In the purposes of this example, it is a SOC 1 report for a payroll service provider, ABC Company's risk and related controls matrix, where management has defined the controls which are in place at the organization, and a completed SOC analyzer tool. You will also see that we have provided examples of the SOC report excerpts to show where the information can be found. To start going through an example, we will complete the SOC analyzer tool line by line and provide an example of where the information necessary is located in the actual report. To begin with, we will document the name of the third-party service provider who is being evaluated by the company. This information can be found on the cover page of the SOC report. In this case, this is the payroll service provider. Next, you will describe the service and the types of transactions processed by the service organization that are in scope for the company. The service is found on the cover page of the SOC report, as you can see by the second arrow. This is the easiest place to locate it. The information can also be found in the body of the report. The company will then add the what the service organization is used for. The reports type can be found on the cover page of the report. Typically, it lists either the SOC 1 or SOC 2. To determine whether the report is type 1 or type 2, you will need to look at the audit period. If the period listed is as of date, this is a type 1 report. If the period listed is between certain dates, this is a type 2 report. For the purposes of this example, this is a type 2 report. Principles covered section will only be relevant if a SOC 2 report is evaluated. In the SOC 2 report, the principles are listed in the opinion letter as well as on the cover page. The service organization can be audited against one or more of the following: security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, or privacy. For the purposes of this evaluation, this section is not applicable. Continuing with the completion of the summary sheet will be the identification of the audit firm who issued the report, which is found on the last page of the opinion letter as the signature. The opinion letter date is found on the last page of the report right underneath the signature and represents when the report was issued.
I would like to jump in and add to this. On the summary sheet, it's really important that when you're filling out this information that you're also evaluating it to make sure that it's appropriate for your needs. A lot of times when you're reviewing it for an SOC audit or a SOC internal controls audit, there is a requirement that the SOC report covers a certain period of time. So making sure that when you're looking up that period of time and then entering it into your worksheet, that you're also evaluating that it's the right period of time. So important things to keep in mind, that it's not just a copy-paste exercise.
Thank you, Erin. Continuing with the completion of the summary sheet, on this slide, this is an extract from a SOC Analyzer tool. However, the next page we will provide examples of where to find the information. First, you will describe the services provided by the sub-service provider. The information can be found on the first page of the opinion letter provided by the auditor. In the same paragraph, the services provided by the sub-service provider are described. Next, you will determine whether the sub-service provider method is inclusive or carve-out. Inclusive method is when the auditor tests the controls as they relate to the sub-service provider. Carve-out is when the sub-service provided is not covered by the service auditor's testing. Typically, the majority of the issued reports have carved out sub-service organizations. If a carve-out method was used, there should be a control within the SOC report to review the sub-service provider's SOC report. If an inclusive method was used, there are no additional procedures required. A common question is often asked, how do I know if it's inclusive or a carve-out? For the carve-out, the specific language to look for in the opinion letter is such information has not been subjected to the procedures applied in our examination, and accordingly, we express no opinion on it. This would be your indication of a carve-out method. For the carve-out reports, you will also need to get an understanding whether the auditor tested a control over the service organization review of the sub-service provider's SOC report. The information is found by reading the narrative of the report, or Section 3, and the controls tested by the auditor, or Section 4.
A lot of times here you would also look for a specific control in the SOC report that says that sub-service organizations' SOC reports have been evaluated. So sometimes it's really simple to just look for that control and see that the evaluation was performed and passed and know that you're okay. Other times that control may not exist, and so like Maria said, you'll have to look for some additional procedures that may have been performed.
Right. And you can see here's the example from the actual SOC report. It is the first page of the opinion letter on the right and an excerpt from the narrative of the report on the left. The second paragraph of the opinion letter states that the organization uses the infrastructure and operations organization as a subservice organization to provide certain hosting operations, data center management, and network management services to support its system. This sentence describes what a subservice organization is and what services it is used for. The paragraph goes on to say that the independent auditor's testing excludes the control objectives and related controls of the subservice organization, which means that this is a carve-out method. As we have discussed, given that this is a carve-out method, it is important to make sure that there is a vendor management control tested in the report, similarly to what Erin said, assuming that there is one available. In this particular case, the Section 3 of the report, which an excerpt is provided on the left, stated that the payroll service provider has separated its operations into multiple entities subject to a SOC report. The carve-out specified in the opinion letter has its own standalone SOC 1 report, which should be evaluated by the ABC company. If the organization's SOC report does not cover your audit period, as to what Erin was saying, a bridge letter will be necessary. For example, if your audit period is from January 1st through June 30th, and the organization's SOC report is for the period ending March 31st, all of that being in 2017, you will need to request a bridge letter at least through June 30th to see if there have been any material changes to the entity's environment which may potentially affect your company. A bridge letter, or sometimes also called a gap letter, is issued by the service organization, not by the independent auditor. An example of a bridge letter is provided on the right. To evaluate a bridge letter, you will need to review it and document the date it was issued and whether there have been any material changes for the period outside of the audit, but before the issuance of the report. This information is specified in the narrative of the letter. There are a few additional fields on the summary sheet. Report and bridge letter receipt status is used to track the status of the reports and or the documentation that has been received by the company. The SOC report evaluation prepared by field is used to track the name of the individual who documented and evaluated the report. The SOC report evaluation reviewed by field is used to track the name of the individual who reviewed the prepared evaluation. Moving on to the Control Reliance tab. Company will read the Section 4 of the SOC report, the independent auditor's testing of the service organization controls, and evaluate whether the control objectives are applicable to the company and whether there are any failures. The screenshot of the Section 4 excerpt is on the right, is a test table completed by the independent auditor. It lists the following: control objectives and related control activities performed by the service organization, test procedures performed and the results of the control testing performed by the service auditors, description of the exceptions or deviations noted by the service auditors. And now going into an example. To complete the Control Reliance step of the SOC Analyzer tool, the following should be performed. For each of the in-scope SOC reports, review the control objectives for SOC 1 or the criteria for SOC 2 provided by the service organization SOC report, and evaluate whether the control objective is relevant to the company. If the control objective is not relevant, document it as a line item with a conclusion. For any control objectives that the company is relying on for the service organization, evaluate the results of the testing performed by the third-party service auditor. For any exceptions, evaluate the impact of the exception to the company's processes and identify any mitigating controls to address the risk. How do you evaluate control exceptions? Well, consider performing a self-assessment of the service auditor's test adequacy of the test procedures performed. Review the responses provided by the service organization and determine whether the responses are satisfactory. Management may also consider discussing the nature of the exceptions with the service auditors. In this particular example, control objective 8 of the report was evaluated. The service provider is listed in the first column since the tool can be used to evaluate multiple service organizations. Then the control objectives or the criteria for which the control activity is stated, the control objective or criteria number, the page of the report it was found on, the actual control specified by the service organization, and the test result. This is all taken from the report. Once you have the information, you as a company need to evaluate if this control objective or criteria is applicable to the company and whether the control had exceptions. If there were exceptions, you want to call out the exception and also evaluate it to see if there is any impact. For example, in the Control 803 about the user access additions, modification, and removal from the system, an exception was identified that there was not supporting documentation in place for the 13 out of 25 randomly selected new users for request and approval. ABC Company, which we're using in this example, evaluated the exception and stated that since access was confirmed as being approved, the impact of the ABC Company was not significant. UCC Mapping Review tab is used for evaluating the complementary user entity controls called out by the service organization, where they state what the user entities need to have in place in order for the system to be secure. Complementary user entity controls are controls which the service organization assumes will be in place at the user entities. Identifies the roles, responsibilities, and obligations of the user entity to ensure achievement of the control objectives identified in the report, also known as the user control, complementary customer controls, or other similar names or phrases. The screenshot on the right is an example of the complementary user controls that will be evaluated on the next slide. For each of the client control considerations, we will list them on the second column of the tool and determine whether it is relevant for the company. For example, one of the client control considerations called out was for setting up a second authentication method for phone or faxing payrolls. However, ABC Company determined that it was not applicable as they did not utilize phone or fax for data transmission. Therefore, none of the subsequent questions applied. Another example is that the client control consideration where the payroll service provider will be notified of the changes in the authorized contacts list. In the fourth column, the ABC Company has listed the existing control under SEC 5, where they review the access lists on a quarterly basis to ensure that the segregation of duties is in place and will notify the company of any changes. Please note that you can map the client control considerations to the existing SOC controls. However, If they're not included, you will need to ensure that you have processes to follow for each. Once the report has been fully evaluated, you are now ready to go back to the summary sheet and complete the conclusion cell to determine the result of the review. For this example, based upon completion and review of the above, the SOC 1 report conveys adequate description and testing of payroll service providers' payroll services to provide reasonable assurance that the control objectives are being met. Insignificant and remediated exceptions were noted by the DEF LLP. Combining the results of their testing with the company's internal controls over the financial reporting, we conclude that the controls over these processes are designed and operating effectively, and no further action is required.
Thanks, Maria. So to wrap this up, we just want to make sure that you guys have some clarification on how to find things that you need to rely on within the SOC report, whether it's the controls, the user control considerations, whether it's what is a carve-out and where might that exist, and then just share kind of with you some of the tools that we use internally to evaluate those things. As we discussed previously, we're seeing a lot of companies that are getting deficiencies because they're failing to identify whether they have an SOC requirement, whether they have a requirement to rely on an SOC report, or even after they do have that SOC report, if they're properly evaluating it and making sure that they understand how it impacts their organization. So these can be very challenging, and Maria and I have done a lot of work with a lot of clients to perform or review SOC reports, and if you have questions, we would love to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Maria and Erin. This is very, very useful information. If you find you have questions about the SOC Audit Analyzer tool or the analysis process, please don't hesitate to contact Erin or Maria directly. They're always happy to talk to you. And thank you for joining us.